This video is sponsored by Raycon. Stick around until the end to hear all about the perfect Valentine's gift for your loved one. Or maybe you just want to block out the depressing chaos happening all around you. We'll be fine. Valentine's Day, a celebration of love, romance, the unity of companionship, and the shameless commercialization of our compassion and tolerance for the people we secretly loathe. As you can tell from that snarky description, I hate everything about it, because I'm a jealous fraud channeling my deep resentful loneliness into a video in which I hope to pathetically gain the approval of strangers. Wait, who wrote this? 1981's My Bloody Valentine might seem like just another addition to seasonal slasher schlock, because, well, it is, but at the same time there's no harm in exploring its forgotten place during the rise of the 80s slasher craze. The thing is, while we tend to spend so much of our time focusing on America's historical infatuation with the subgenre, we forget that Canada is just as equally responsible for the influx of slashers, and in many respects arguably had just as much, if not more, influence over it. After 1974's seasonal slasher Black Christmas, which retrospectively was groundbreaking for the genre at the time, there was a mad dash by studios to cash in on the vicious morbid magic by churning out generic slasher flicks like they were going out of style, despite there having yet to be a style in which to run out of. While America's Halloween and its respective ripoff Friday the 13th helped greatly popularize the genre within the mainstream, in 1980 Canada released both Prom Night and Terror Train starring Halloween's Jamie Lee Curtis to great commercial success. Both films helped to further establish the formula that defined the subgenre going into the new decade, but when it came time for My Bloody Valentine to get in on the action the following year, it ended up being a disappointing commercial result when compared to Paramount's other more prominent summer camp killer. Now, it's not uncommon for a lot of horror movies to get a positive re-evaluation in later years, but My Bloody Valentine is definitely in the category of being potentially considered misunderstood for its time, even if there is very little to it. The film suffered from notable censorship before its North American release, as the MPAA, the Motion Picture Association of America, deemed it simply too violent for an R rating, forcing producers to cut down significant portions of each death scene, to the point that the film isn't even all that violent when compared to its contemporaries. While its re-release in 2009 to coincide with the release of the remake, which we will absolutely get to later in the video, saw 3 extra minutes of footage added to the final runtime, the full extent of its graphic violence has never been released to the public. The film's director George Miyake argued that the heavy censorship was due to the potential controversy it could have received, releasing 2 months after the assassination of peace-loving musician John Lennon that still dominated the media. Although at the time, censorship wasn't exactly anything new either. In fact, most slasher flicks typically ended up censored in some way or another, especially after the immense condemnation spurring from films like Friday the 13th for allegedly glorifying and promoting violence. Anyway, My Bloody Valentine is set in the small fictional town of the appropriately named Valentine's Bluff, where 20 years ago a methane explosion trapped the local miners within the tunnels, where the sole survivor Harry Warden resorted to cannibalism before his eventual rescue. A year later, Warden returned to town to kill the 2 supervisors responsible for the miners' abandonment, vowing murderous reprisal if the town continued to host the Valentine's Day dance. Despite the town supposedly forgetting the tragedy, on the eve of the dance, the local mayor and sheriff receive a Valentine's box containing a human heart, believing that Harry has escaped the institution and has returned to town to continue his deadly rampage. Well, censored deadly rampage. So the closest comparison I can make to My Bloody Valentine is that it takes most of its cinematography, gruesome murders, and sense of humour directly from Black Christmas. Its greatest strength is its thick Canadian charm, where so many of its characters are filled with joy and excitement that you really don't want to see any of them get butchered. Hell, they're all so nice that if they were to get stabbed in the face, they would be the ones apologising for walking into the knife. Despite the cold weather, there is a warmth to these characters as they share in the loving spirit of Valentine's Day. Like with Black Christmas, the horror is initially planted in the back of your mind, and akin to the innocent victims, you end up letting your guard down as you immerse yourself in the inviting, friendly atmosphere. However, when it comes to the central protagonists, they're portrayed with surprisingly stern demeanors that, when we're not just observing the supporting cast getting up to quirky shenanigans, the film ends up taking itself far more seriously than its campy slasher premise entails. I mean, I understand it makes sense to reinforce the danger, but outside the killer's rampage, the only other drama to occur is a tense love triangle between the mayor's son Tom, his colleague and adversary Axel, and their love interest Sarah. It does eventually come back into play, but the general plot is ultimately a very paint-by-numbers back and forth between the party animals preparing for an illegal dance after it's cancelled out of fear of Harry's threat, and the sheriff investigating Harry's presence and the murders happening around town. Unlike its superior contemporaries, I feel it's missing a certain allure or mystique to truly play into the domestic horror of its time. While the feeling of safety being slowly chipped away is certainly there, I'll be honest, I think its biggest problem is that Harry Warden's threat just never feels all that tangible. It's certainly the most debatable part of the film's appeal, and I don't disagree with anyone who feels the opposite because my expectations were inevitably set so high when you consider Warden against his peers. He just doesn't stick with me as heavily, yet I think it's more so to do with how much of a disservice the censorship does to his image. He certainly looks the part, but his actions are so visually diluted that we only get a glimmer of that provocativeness. I know showing violence isn't necessary, as Texas Chainsaw and Halloween both proved, but when those films beat you to the punch with domestic commentary, something more raw needs to be done to stand out in a market that was quickly becoming saturated, which is basically what other slashers like Friday the 13th and Maniac did as a result. Although, spoiler warning to those who plan on checking it out, part of that downplayed iconic appeal could also be because of the film's cool little plot twist that reveals Harry has been dead all along, so there must be a copycat. Remember that love triangle I mentioned? Well, it turns out Axel is the killer. When he was a child, he witnessed his father get murdered by Warden as he was one of the supervisors responsible for the mining tragedy, and this trauma manifested into a split personality. Obviously, I wouldn't read into the psychology beyond that, but I guess you could say it adds a garnish to the film, as it's a nice detail, but it doesn't affect anything in the story, unlike, say, the killer reveal in the first Friday the 13th, where it recontextualizes the events of the story. Yet, to its credit, it makes for a haunting conclusion when Axel disappears deeper into the abandoned mines as he manically vows vengeance on the town, asking Sarah to be his bloody Valentine. It's even further capped off by an original acoustic ballad about the legend of Harry Warden that's far catchier than I expected it to be. In fact, it's probably up there with the theme from Cannibal Holocaust. Now, let's talk about the 2009 American remake, because it's, well, it's unique to say the least. This version knew exactly what it was doing. It was created with the sole intent of cashing in on the 3D craze that emerged with the hype surrounding the upcoming technological powerhouse that was James Cameron's Avatar. Yet, to its credit, the My Bloody Valentine remake was one of the few movies at the time to be shot entirely with early 4K 3D technology, rather than the post-conversion crap that forced in the effect where it clearly wasn't shot or designed to be. As a result, from what I've heard from people who saw it in theaters when it first came out, it actually worked pretty well and did as it was intended. My experience was with those crappy blue and red filter glasses that could not replicate the effect on standard definition televisions, but I can totally see how this would have been a lot of fun to see in theaters. The movie is basically unfiltered gore porn, and I'm surprised it got away with it. It is unashamedly crass with its gratuitous nudity and splatter violence that it can't decide if it wants to be an exploitation B-movie or just a straight up cartoon. I can see what it's going for with its semi-self-aware popcorn violence. It's everything that the original film couldn't be, but when it comes to anything and everything outside the 3D, however, nothing else works. The characters are dull and lifeless, there is virtually no tension or surprise, and lacks any of the charm or quirky sensibilities of the original. One way to describe it was that it was clearly manufactured as the ultimate horror guilty pleasure, but it doesn't feel sincere enough to earn that title because not all of its campy qualities feel natural when it still takes itself way too seriously. It basically hoped to edgelord its way to that reputation, but that doesn't necessarily mean it's irredeemable, because it does have some admittedly clever aspects to it. You can tell director Patrick Lussier is more of an editor by trade, having cut Wes Craven's New Nightmare and Scream, for example, because for a 3D film, while the tension isn't there, which would be the sign of a good director, the death scenes are very well pieced together with the right amount of momentum and match of action to get the full impact of a kill. At heart, it is still a very mean-spirited film, but the death scenes are a spectacle in a sense, because it makes the most gratifying use of its 3D. It's one of the few times where you have to admit the gimmick actually pays off. Getting into the story, despite the hollowness of the characters and the severe lack of charm, I do have to admire how it recontextualizes details and events to make certain characters more relevant and play against the expectations of those who saw the original. In the remake, we learn that the mining tragedy is now solely Tom's fault for not venting the methane, causing an explosion that led to Harry murdering his colleagues to conserve oxygen before falling into a coma and awakening 1 year later. We then see the original's ending remade to have Harry go on a vengeful murder spree to track down Tom, ending with Tom being left traumatized instead of Axel as a wounded Harry disappears into the mines. From here we jump 10 years later, where Axel is now the sheriff instead of a miner whose father was murdered, and Tom has returned to sell the mines which were owned by his deceased father, rather than Tom being simply the son of the mayor like in the original. It adds a bit more complexity to everyone's relationships. The town is now openly hostile towards Tom's arrival because his negligence at the mines resulted in a brutal massacre, souring the town's reputation. Axel is now married to Sarah but is an unfaithful piece of shit, and the now retired sheriff confirms that Harry's body was found and buried long ago, and wishes for the town to simply forget his existence. The big difference is that Tom is revealed to be the killer instead of Axel, but it couldn't be any more painfully obvious, regardless of how many times the film tries to throw you off the scent using Tom as an unreliable narrator, because his arrival is timed just too conveniently with the new spree of murders, and that's not forgetting we're already aware of his trauma, and so there's not really any reason to suspect anyone else. Yet, predictability aside, it actually makes more thematic sense that Tom is the killer. In the original, Axel's reveal is just a tacked on surprise, but in the remake, Tom is bearing the burden of all these deaths that he is both directly and indirectly responsible for. His negligence created the ruthless killer Harry became, so it sort of acts as both a domino effect and a twisted punishment for Tom not being held accountable for his actions. I'm obviously giving it more credit than the film presents it with, but the filmmakers do deserve at least a nod for treating it as more of a homage to the original and adding their own substance, rather than just making it a straightforward cash grab. And that's My Bloody Valentine. If anything, I think my biggest grievance is that the story actually has nothing to do with Valentine's Day. Sure, the love triangle is something, but it doesn't do anything substantial or thematic with it. Other than being set on said day, the title was simply the producer's idea of improving its box office potential, since films with a seasonal association tend to do better with audiences. So if you've seen either the original or remake of My Bloody Valentine, let me know your thoughts in the comments below. And while you're at it, let me tell you all about Raycon's Everyday E25 earbuds, the best and boldest way to listen to my soothing, sexy accent in future videos, or to simply block out the world burning all around you. I have been using Raycon for nearly a year now, whether it be at the gym, listening to music or audiobooks, or crapping myself while watching horror movies, and they have been persistently reliable. They are comfortable, lightweight, affordable, and the seamless Bluetooth pairing means I can move around most of my house without needing to carry my connected device, which is great because I really need to cut down on how much I stare at screens on a regular basis, like my eyes are fucked. Raycon earbuds give you 6 hours of playtime, more bass, and a more compact design to give you that nice, non-intrusive, noise-isolating fit, along with several different bud sizes to make it the best experience for you, blah 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 blah. Also, look at that nice smoking hot color choice you get there. Yeah, I picked blue. Twice, in fact. On a serious note, they are genuinely great. I do highly recommend them, so if you want to get your own E25 earbuds, click the link in the description box below or go to buyraycon.com/Ryan to get 15% off your order. And until next time, stay safe, stay out of the mines, hashtag Team Blue, and I'll see you all next time.